I am Brian Champion, the Political Science and World Politics Librarian and coordinator of the House of Learning Lecture Series. We welcome students, colleagues, faculty, and invited guests here today to hear Professor Mark Choate of the Department of History deliver today's House of Learning lecture entitled The Berlin Airlift and the Projection of American Military Power. The library sponsors two main lectures and lecture series, the House of Learning Lectures and the Alice Louise Reynolds Women in Scholarship Lecture, which this year will be held on Thursday, the 29th of November at 2 p.m. in this auditorium, when Professor Martha Peacock of the Department of Visual Arts will deliver an address entitled Heroines, Harpies, and Housewives, Women of Consequence in the Dutch Golden Age, and we warmly invite you all to attend. Through these lectures, the library brings together scholars and students to engage in a civil discussion of ideas, and in so doing, the library contributes to building a learned community which fosters the faithful life of the mind. The House of Learning Lectures series title is taken from the 88th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, verse 119, where the Lord instructs the saints to prepare every needful thing, even a house of learning. Because the library is the campus repository for the literature of all academic disciplines and scholarship, the library is well positioned to be considered BYU's House of Learning. The Harold B. Lee Library takes seriously its campus role as the intellectual heart of inquiry and knowledge, and is honored to provide this House of Learning lecture today. Now, about today's lecturer. Professor Mark Choate began his undergraduate studies at the University of Oklahoma, and in 1995 received his B.A. magna cum laude at Yale. Still at Yale, he then received his M.A. and M.Phil degrees in 1996 and 98, and his Ph.D. in history from Yale in 2002. His dissertation on Italian colonialism and migration, supported by a Fulbright scholarship, was awarded Yale's Hans Gatzke Prize for Outstanding Dissertation in European History. A paper he presented in August 2001 at the International Conference of Historical Geographers in Quebec was awarded the Andrew Hill Clark Prize by the American Academy of Geographers. Professor Choate has also presented conference papers at meetings of the American Historical Association, the Association for the Study of Ethnicity and Nationalism, the Association for the Study of Modern Italy, and the French Colonial History Society. His articles and reviews have appeared in journals such as Forum Italicum, Modern Italy, French Colonial History, the International Journal of African Historical Studies, the Journal of Modern Italian Studies, and International Migration Review. Professor Choate joined the BYU History Department in August 2001, where he teaches courses on Europe since 1914, Italy since 1848, world civilizations since 1500, and on European fascisms. His first book, Emigrant Nation, Italians in the Global Fatherland, is forthcoming from Harvard University Press. In addition to his Catholic intellectual interests, Professor Choate is also a mentor to a generation of new historians and scholars. Students who find BYU's history faculty provide a rich training ground for tutoring in the arts of historical research. It is with a great deal of pleasure that we welcome today our featured House of Learning lecture speaker, Professor Mark Choate.
Thanks very much. I'm honored to give the Veterans Day edition of this House of Learning lecture series, and I thank Brian Champion for the invitation. This lecture addresses three questions. Why was there a Berlin airlift? Why was it important in the Cold War? And why is it important today? The Cold War that gripped the world for 5 decades grew directly out of the Second World War. And I want to show a map of the Axis power at that time. Although the Axis was an alliance of Germany, Japan, and Italy, Germany was the main economic and industrial power behind the Axis worldwide. And this explains why Germany continued to play such a prominent and important role in international relations through the Cold War. Germany was a symbol of the past war and a symbol for the future of Europe. How Germany would go would determine the fate of Europe, fascist, communist, or capitalist. And Berlin, at the center of the swastika here in this map, was a flashpoint between the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the United States-led blocs, not just for the Berlin airlift, but also for the Berlin Wall crisis of 1961, and even the Cuban Missile Crisis the following year. President Kennedy was worried still about Berlin as the center of the Cold War. And throughout the Korean War, the United States kept more forces in Germany than in Korea during the entire conflict. During the war itself, defeating the Germans was a major motivation and priority for the United States on the home front as well. And this poster, Bundles for Berlin, Bombs for Berlin, was displayed in factories to motivate workers to give their utmost to defeat the Axis as soon as possible. During the war as well, the future of Germany and Europe was discussed by the Big Three, the leaders of Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union: Churchill, President Roosevelt, and Stalin. In the wartime planning, the two sides, the Americans and British coming from the West and the Soviets coming from the East, divided Germany and Europe so they could coordinate their efforts. And in effect, they split Germany and Austria months ahead of the collapse of Nazi and fascist forces. The Soviet Union had the longest front in the East and carried the biggest burden throughout the war. And so the Soviets, quote, liberated, end quote, Warsaw, Vienna, Bratislava, Budapest, Prague, and Berlin. And their prestige was really tremendous coming out of the war as they roll the invading Nazi fascist forces back well into Germany and play a heroic role during the war. This picture shows when the Soviet and American forces met at the prearranged boundary at Torgau, Germany. And here the American soldiers are dancing with the female Soviet soldiers. And the banner shows a welcome for the Americans, with America misspelled, but true camaraderie and respect between the two sides who have worked so hard through the 6 years of war. During the war itself, approximately 15 million military and 35 million civilians died. Total of approximately 50 million dead, including approximately 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust perpetrated by the Nazi regime. Also note in this picture the portrait of Stalin hanging from the tree. Stalin himself has enormous prestige from this conflict, And it's a Soviet flag that flies over the former German Imperial Parliament in Berlin, as Berlin itself is liberated by Soviet forces. Several months after the collapse of Nazi Germany, the Big Three meet for the last time. President Roosevelt has died, so the United States is represented by President Truman. And midway through the conference, Winston Churchill lost elections in Britain and was replaced by Clement Attlee. And here at the Potsdam Conference, the Big Three reiterate their wartime agreements of how Europe would be divided. All three make a commitment for democratic rule and democratic elections in all the countries of Europe. And the borders of Poland are moved 100 miles to the west at Germany's expense to expand the Soviet Union and basically shift the Polish populations. So this is the post-war agreement, dividing Germany and Austria, annexed to Hitler's Third Reich, by the four occupying powers: the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and the United States. Here you can see the Russian zone in the east of Germany and also the east of Austria, with the two capitals, Berlin and Vienna, jointly occupied by all four powers, all four victorious powers. Now, the world is much less naive in 1945 than it had been in 1918. No one really expects that the Second World War was the war to end all wars, as the Great War, the First World War, had been supposed to be. People in Eastern and Western Europe both expect that Germany will rise again and that some scores will still be settled. So to rearrange the map of Europe, Stalin organizes an expulsion of Germans across the continent. 12 million Germans expelled, euphemistically called displaced persons, crowded into a smaller Germany. And there's another question of what the Americans will do for their part. There's still good feelings between the three allies, and in September 1945, the American Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, proposed sharing the atomic bomb, the weapon which had won the war and ended the conflict against Japan, with both the British and the Soviets to prevent an arms race. But there's disagreement over that as well. Truman, after losing the election and falling out of political favor, gives a lecture in Truman's home state, Missouri, at Westminster College. In his college lecture, Churchill warns the world about an iron curtain of Soviet tyranny descending upon Eastern Europe, that the Soviet occupation would not remain merely an occupation but a domination of the future of Europe. Now, many people dismiss Churchill's fears, much as he was dismissed in the 1930s when he was warning about Nazi Germany. But a year later, by 1947, Churchill's views have become widespread in the United States, a fear of the Soviet former ally. And in March 1947, President Truman announces the Truman Doctrine, that the United States will fight communism around the world in a policy of containment to hold the Soviet Union to their current gains. And the United States promises assistance to any country threatened by the communists, starting with Greece and Turkey. So the United States takes up Britain's commitments, which they're not able to maintain because of their economic devastation from the war. So this is a change in American policy. It's peacetime, but the Americans have committed their world power to maintaining stability in Europe. So the United States is not going to turn away from Europe as they had done after the First World War. It's the opposite of the old idea of appeasement, of giving the little countries over to the big countries' demands. and in fact, the United States eventually develops the domino theory that little countries are important because they stand as symbols for the future of the world. And if little countries follow communism, many more will follow. The threat of war remains in Europe and in Germany. In fact, the peace treaty for Germany is not signed until 1990 with the end of the Cold War. So throughout the Cold War, this occupation of Germany, the rights of the occupying powers, will continue. The United States worries that with the economic devastation, not just in Britain, but across the continent, that instability will ensue, much as during the Great Depression, which was the chance for the Nazis to come to power. So at another college lecture at the Harvard University graduation of 1947, George C. Marshall, the former Army Chief of Staff and now Truman's Secretary of State, announces a new program to help rebuild Europe, no strings attached, to build healthy free market economies throughout the continent to help the whole world's economic growth and to build prosperity and freedom everywhere. And this poster produced in Western Germany captures the spirit of this daring enterprise. All the countries of Europe united together with the economic recovery plan propelling them forward into the future. This offer was for Western and Eastern Europe both, communist and non-communist. Also an offer to Germany and Italy, the enemies which the United States has just spent years and hundreds of thousands of lives to defeat. To rebuild the enemies and rebuild the entire continent as a unit of stability and progress. But Stalin prohibits Eastern Europe from accepting the funds. So you can see in the lower left-hand corner of the poster Czechoslovakia on the map, the flags of the countries accepting the aid. And they accept the aid, but Stalin makes them turn it back. And this is a turning point in the Cold War when in February 1948 the Soviet Union overthrows the democratic government of Czechoslovakia. The foreign minister of Czechoslovakia is brutally murdered, and the president, Edvard Beneš, has to capitulate to the Soviet Union. And he was the same man who had to capitulate to Hitler in 1938. So at this point it is clear that the Soviets are no longer to be trusted. Their idea of democracies in Eastern Europe is much different than the American and British idea. The people's democracies will be subject to Soviet control within strict parameters. And this is also the dividing point on the future of Germany. At Yalta, Stalin had secured the right to extract $20 billion in reparations from Germany to pay back the Soviet Union for the deprivations caused by the Nazis. But the Western Allies moved to stop Soviet incursions in their occupation zone. They want the Germans to be employed instead of homeless and poverty-stricken. And General Lucius Clay, successor to Eisenhower as military governor of Germany, closes the American zone to Soviet pillaging in May 1946. And France, Britain, and the United States begin to organize an economic system in their zone of Germany and their part of Berlin to begin with a new currency. Why is this currency so important? Why does this actually become the instigation for the Berlin Airlift? In fact, communism is an economic system, and capitalism is an economic system. And so economics hold a political and ideological value as well, and the currency stands for something much bigger, the future of how people will work and exchange goods and how their future will develop. And so to respond to the currency declaration, on June 24th, 1948, Stalin and the Soviets cut off access to West Berlin by rail, road, and river. All surface traffic to West Berlin is cut off to starve out the western zone occupied by the capitalist powers and to bring it into the Russian zone, which surrounds it on all sides. How will the United States respond? General Clay proposed an armed convoy of supplies across the regular land route, but is overruled by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's already, though, begun an airlift of supplies to the stranded city the very day that the blockade, the embargo, has been declared. Now, Stalin doesn't worry about an airlift or an air bridge, Luftbrücke in German. The last time this was attempted was in the relief of Stalingrad in 1942. Hermann Göring, Hitler's air minister, had been very successful in the Spanish Civil War in 1936 in using air power to move material, men, and goods. And he promises Hitler that he can supply by air the 6th Army cut off by Soviet forces in the city of Stalingrad. This meets with dramatic failure, as the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, is only able to bring in a tiny fraction of the supplies needed by the quarter of a million German troops trapped in the city. And eventually, the German soldiers there starved and froze. Clay has now committed to bring all the supplies needed by 2.5 million people in West Berlin. And the Soviets are confident that the airlift will fail and that there's no need to oppose it actively. There were only 3 air routes agreed upon during the war for access to the city. Yet General Clay is confident that this airlift can be successful. This is the baptism for the creation of the United States Air Force, which had been organized as a separate division of the U.S. military only the previous year, in 1947. It's still the early days of transoceanic air travel and the early days of air power. So this will be a trial and a test of Allied logistics, if they can supply the 3 sectors in the west of the capital of Berlin. This shows the available airports. Tempelhof, in the center of the city, was the scene of the great Zeppelin dirigible flights of the 1920s and 30s. Gatow, in the farthest west part of the city, was also an available airport, but Tegel in the French sector is actually built during the blockade itself by the so-called rubble women. Berliners say that rubble is a geological specialty of their city, following all the destruction of the war. 19,000 in a construction crew work around the clock to build another airport to relieve the pressure on the blockade. The standard tempo of the airlift was one plane arriving every 90 seconds on one runway, and then another plane leaving every 90 seconds on another runway, 24 hours a day. Plane taking off and a plane leaving every 90 seconds. 32 aircraft were always in the air simultaneously on the 264-mile route. But at the peak of the airlift, in April 1949, planes are arriving and leaving every 60 seconds. Really an amazing feat of organization and dedication. During the blockade, the Berlin Economic Emergency Society continues economic activity and capitalist production. 2,500 tons of industrial goods made in blockaded Berlin are flown out of Berlin by March 1949 to show the resiliency under the threat of communist domination. Capitalism had been really discredited in the Great Depression, and now, though, people cling to all the freedoms associated with capitalism: free production, choice of consumption, free exchange of information, and also free speech. The children of Berlin are growing up under strange circumstances. Many fathers had never come home from the war itself, and here they're facing another stress with strict ration from the goods that are flown in. Yet children present the human face of this challenge. Here the children are playing airlift, basically, with a reconstruction of the circular Tempelhof airport, and they present the strain of the airlift in human terms. Lieutenant Gail Halverson from our own state of Utah was a lieutenant involved with the airlift, and he traveled on a flight to the city, not as part of his airlift duties, but just to try to meet some of the people of Berlin. And he met some of the children who did not even ask for candy, as was his common experience. They just wanted to meet these people who were supplying the needed food for their families. He promised to bring more candy the next day, and promised to signal the approach of his plane by wiggling the wings upon his approach. And then he would drop candy, chocolate, and raisins in small parachutes out of the flare chute near his pilot's seat. He started this as a personal endeavor, supplemented by candy rations from his fellow aviators. But a newspaper reporter in Berlin was hit on the head by a parachuting chocolate bar, and found out about this secret story and put it on the front page. So Halverson was called in to his commanding officer to explain what he'd been doing, but got full support. And with publicity, more and more people in the United States supported his efforts. This really caught people's imagination because the abstract numbers of tons delivered was hard for people to fathom. But candy for a child could be a symbol for the resiliency and for the future of Germany itself. Radio stations across the east coast of the United States asked for donations of handkerchiefs for parachutes. And at the peak of the Operation Little Vittles, named for the main operation of Operation Vittles, 5 mailbags full of handkerchiefs would arrive in Germany every other day. The Weekly Reader, the children's newsletter, encouraged children in the United States to send contributions to their fellow children in Germany. And the American Confectioners Association shipped 3.5 tons of candy to Massachusetts, where school children attached parachutes to the packages for the children of West Berlin. And Gail Halverson, nicknamed the Candy Bomber, by January 1949 had dropped more than 250,000 parachutes loaded with candy on the city of Berlin for the nearly 100,000 children trapped in West Berlin. He also dropped the candy on East Berlin, but the Soviets protested as a capitalist trick. By May 1949, after the peak of the airlift itself, the Easter parade of planes landing every 60 seconds, Stalin abandons his embargo of the city. But the airlift continues until September 30th, even though surface access to the city had been restored, to show that the airlift could have continued indefinitely. And by the end, the total cost stood at $224 million after the delivery of 2.3 million tons of food, fuel, machinery, and other supplies. Of the flights, the United States made 189,000. The United Kingdom made 87,000 flights with contracted aircraft, and France made 424 flights, all three occupying powers contributing. Australian, New Zealander, and South African Air Forces also sent crews to fly with the British Royal Air Force in this effort. And I think this image of the barefoot Berliner girl speaking with basically an anonymous American pilot summarizes the emotions of this heroic effort. The Americans had been bombing Germany into rubble just 3 years before, but now make this great sacrifice and effort to bring food and coal to these people. As you can see from the statistics, coal was the most heavy and biggest part of the airlift itself. Several died in the airlift, 31 American soldiers and airmen, and also a sailor and a civilian, 39 from the United Kingdom, and between 9 and 12 Germans also die. General Clay is a legendary hero in the city of Berlin for succoring the city in its hour of need and turning to the help of a former enemy. And his comment is on the airlift: to do more would have been a direct threat to the peace, something not to be undertaken lightly. To have done less would have been an abdication of our American honor and traditions. The airlift was forced on us, but once we accepted the challenge, the problem was attacked with characteristic American ingenuity. The results have been historic. Now, this long airlift is a turning point in the creation of a divided Germany. The sovereign state of the Federal Republic of Germany is created from the American, British, and French zones in September 1949, and the Soviet zone becomes the German Democratic Republic the following month. Also during the airlift, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is created as a defensive alliance and military organization against the Soviet bloc. And shortly after the end of the airlift, the Soviet Union conducts its first successful test of its own atomic bomb. This was also an application of military technology. The C-47 was the main workhorse for the Second World War supply of American forces and in the Berlin airlift as well. And the newer C-54, the civilian plane DC-4, carried more than three times as much and made the difference in the success of the airlift. But the United States continues in developing more and more airlift capability, and one of the biggest planes flying is the C-5 Galaxy, which can carry 100 tons today in transoceanic supply. The C-17 carrying 85 tons, and the C-130, which can land on dirt airstrips for tactical airlift, can carry 21 tons. Now, looking at the airlift, one wonders what kind of effort was this? It wasn't military force, it wasn't war, it wasn't bombing Berlin, it wasn't combat. And in fact, the military defines it in negative terms. This is an example of military operations other than war, the acronym MOOTW, or MUTWA. Other than war, but not war itself. And the importance of such an effort, military effort but not war, was not even clear at the time. General Clay later explained in an interview how he went to Washington to ask the Joint Staffs for more C-54 planes. Quote, "I came back to Washington because I knew if we could get some more DC-4s, the airlift would be successful. We'd had some, but not enough. The United States had about 40 DC-4s left, and the chief of their forces did not want to give them to me on the basis that he would have all of his forces committed. If a war came, they would be destroyed in Berlin, and the United States would be without transport. That was all brought up at a meeting of the National Security Council, over which the President presided. I made an impassioned plea, but the Joint Chiefs and everyone else were opposed. Without these airplanes, I didn't think the airlift could have made it, and I was obviously quite depressed." End quote. President Truman, however, told General Clay, quote, "Don't you worry, you're going to have your airplanes." And the airplanes arrived. Quote, "From then on out, there was no longer any problem, to my part, of the airlift being a success. Truman realized that the Berlin crisis was a political war, not a physical military war. I am not being critical of the Joint Chiefs of Staff because I think they visualized it as a military operation." End quote. So, after fighting the Second World War, the Joint Chiefs of Staff were still thinking in military terms, that they couldn't commit all of their reserves right to the front of American forces in Berlin. But Truman made a political decision that this is not a war of bullets and bombs, but a political war of symbols and strategy. And the Berlin airlift was the key in winning the successful support of world opinion right at the beginning of the Cold War. Now, airlift is still a key to humanitarian efforts in the world today. The massive C-5 can carry 2 tanks, but it can also carry 100 tons of humanitarian supplies. And in wartime today, it's not just a struggle of death and destruction, but also of humanitarian relief. For example, following the massive Indian Ocean tsunami of December 2004, the Pacific Command distributed nearly $1 billion in U.S. aid and supplies through naval power, much of it to the Muslim countries of Southeast Asia. So this $1 billion can be compared to the cost of combat operations today, and also its returns in public opinion can be compared, as this brought much favorable opinion and exposure to the United States from Muslim countries worldwide, as the United States assisted the Muslim peoples devastated by the earthquake and tsunami. So the projection of military power holds a major military role. For example, as General Tunner, who organized the Berlin airlift, airlifted a bridge for the evacuation of cut-off American forces during the Korean War. Not quite as depicted as in this time cover of wings attached to a bridge, but still just as effective and just as much appealing to the imagination. The airlift also delivers humanitarian supplies. So here on the right are milk bottles for the milk run, delivery of milk to West Berlin, and then on the left an ad for Douglas Aircraft Company for their military planes. Milk as a weapon of democracy. Milk is not actually a weapon of democracy, but its supply shows the United States cares about people, helping people live and thrive, feeding children milk rather than killing them through a military effort. The Africa Command of the U.S. military, to be established on the African continent, has a major mission of humanitarian relief across the continent rather than military operations, rather than traditional combat military operations. There's no strategic threat on the African continent against the United States. But the United States wants to build peace and stability and order and support on the African continent. And this will be primarily through humanitarian and civil affairs missions. So I want to close by contrasting this with the revolution in military affairs promised by Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld in 2001 of precision munitions and effects-based warfare as the future of military strength. And this was, in fact, overblown. The effect, as it turned out, was enemies running for cover and hiding until the effect wore off, and then returning to fight. And in fact, winning wars requires effort using proven military projection of power. Thank you.